Hi, welcome to Formula Citizen, episode 1. I'm your host, Nate Godfrey. Thank you so much for joining me. Wow, launching a new podcast is very much a leap of faith. There's a hell of a lot of work that goes into just getting to this point, recording episode 1. I wanted to start with a story. So last week I was fortunate to attend an event hosted by F1 Experiences, and Crofty was there, the voice of Formula 1, and I bumped into him and he said, "Mate, what's this Formula Citizen?" And I said, "It's a podcast I'm planning on launching next week, but I'll be really honest with you, I'm having doubts. I'm not sure if I'll go ahead with it." And he just stopped and said, no. He said, "You're a fan, mate. You're passionate. You're knowledgeable about the sport. Just be yourself and just share." That was his advice. It's good advice. So thank you, Crofty. Look, the purpose of a podcast for me is to find your people. Now, I'm a Formula One citizen. And my hope is that through this podcast, we can connect with a group of citizens and become a family. And if that family grows, it becomes a team. And eventually that team can become a community. So that's the end goal. That's the intent behind this podcast. I'm going to spend a few minutes before we talk about the Formula One off season and everything that's happened, just talking about my why. I've been a fan of Formula One for 40 years. For me, it's more than a sport. It's an entertainment product. It's a passion. When I was 7 years old, we grew up in New Zealand. My father took me to the first Australian Formula One Grand Prix in Adelaide, and it in many ways changed my life. Just that sound, that high-pitched sound of the cars roaring through the streets of Adelaide. I'll never forget it. And I've been a fan ever since. My dad's actually listening in right now. Hi, Dad. He promised me that he'd listen in. He's a huge Formula One fan. The second reason is as you get a little bit older, family comes along, right? So my wife could care less about Formula One. I have 2 beautiful daughters who I love so much. And they love the bright colored cars. And sometimes they indulge Dad and they sit down on the sofa with me and they watch a few minutes of Formula One. And it's pretty cool. But to be honest, I need more than that, right? I see a Formula One race weekend as an escape. So maybe you're listening in right now and you can relate to this, but for me, it's escapism from everyday life. And I catch myself in the hours before a race thinking about the teams and the drivers and how they're preparing for the race. Certainly after the race, I catch myself digesting content, analyzing the comms, race strategy, just making sense of everything that took place in a Formula One race. So maybe you're the same, and hopefully this podcast can be that experience for you. I'm conscious I've been speaking for a few minutes and I haven't talked about the who. Who is Nate? You're probably asking. As I said, grew up in New Zealand. I'm based in Adelaide. I call Adelaide home now. I live in the Adelaide Hills in a small township called Stirling. I'm a runner, run 7 marathons on 7 continents, and I work as a sports executive. I've worked in the professional sports industry for the last 15 years, which I'd like to think gives me some great insights in terms of this podcast. So I've worked in the AFL at an AFL club. So for my friends in America, that's the equivalent of the NFL. I've also worked as CEO of a rugby club in New Zealand, a club that's produced over 200 All Black players. So if you understand rugby, and you understand New Zealand culture, you'll understand that pedigree. And I'm currently General Manager of Football Australia. So again, for my friends in the States, that's soccer. So I work for Soccer Australia, and I'm leading a project where we're launching a new pro league in October this year. So I'll come at this podcast from 2 angles. One is the commercial and marketing lens, and the other one is this high performance lens. You can expect an episode of Formula Citizen to drop after every race. I will always give you my honest opinion, but I'll always do that with research and data to back me up. And certainly, I want you to challenge me. This podcast is not about me. It is about the fans. I want to give the fans a voice. So please contribute. I'm going to invite some guest speakers on the show throughout the year, but I'm also searching for talent. I'm searching for 2 co-hosts from other parts of the world. That's the beauty of Formula One, is that it's global. So if you're listening in right now, and you love Formula One and you've always dreamed of being on a podcast or hosting a podcast, and maybe the Formula Citizen brand resonates with you and you think you can add value, then reach out to me, send me a video and tell me why you'd love to be a host on this show. We're going to spend most of the year looking at some of these videos. We may share a few of those videos. It's a chance for the audience to tune in as it continues to grow. And then in August, in the summer break, we're going to announce 2 co-hosts who are going to join me on the show. It's something a little bit different and something I'm sure a lot of people will buy into. I want to move forward and talk about the agenda. It's been a really busy off-season in Formula One, as it always is. So I want to touch on a few key elements. One is the Liberty Media financial report. So I want to talk about the state of play from a commercial perspective and where Formula One's currently at. I want to talk about the F1 75 anniversary event that took place in London at the O2 Arena a few weeks ago. I want to touch on some issues with the FIA, the governing body for motorsport, I want to touch on a quick update on the testing. Obviously, the teams were in Bahrain last week and they hit the track. It would be impossible not to talk about Netflix Drive to Survive Season 7 that just dropped a few days ago. I want to talk about my 5 biggest headlines for season 2025 and also my prediction for who I think will be the Formula One world champion. I don't like predictions, but I'm at least going to present a case for why I think this driver can win the world title in 2025. Little spoiler alert, it's not Max or Lando. All right, moving forward. Quick snapshot of Formula One. Liberty Media recently announced a $3.65 billion profit. That's the 4th consecutive year that they've had top-line growth. The sport's averaging 85 million viewers across the 24-race calendar globally. And recent Nielsen reports suggest there's now 750 million fans around the world. They've just announced in the last few days an 11th team, an 11th license has been issued to Cadillac, and they'll be on the grid in 2026. And again, this is only going to help grow the reach of the sport, particularly in America, with a brand like Cadillac joining the grid. Off the track commercially, they've just announced Louis Vuitton as a new partner. That investment is reported to be around $1 billion over the next 10 years. Louis Vuitton is also the naming rights sponsor of the Australian Grand Prix. So just think about this for a moment. In summary, Liberty Media purchased Formula One back in 2017 from Bernie Ecclestone, previous owner, at a cost of $8 billion. And right now, the market cap, the market valuation on Formula One is $30 billion. It's an incredible ROI. And clearly that's reflected in the growing fan base as well around the world. All right, I want to move forward and talk about the F1 75 anniversary event. There's been some polarizing views and opinions on the success of this event. Was it a one-off? Will it continue in future years? I liked it. It reminded me of the Olympic Games opening ceremony. Every team had 7 minutes to kind of present their brand and showcase their story. And there was a great MC who was a little bit edgy, which is always a good thing. What I loved the most was that some of the teams used it as a platform to launch their marketing campaign for 2025. I think McLaren did it better than any other team. Not only did they weave in the narrative around showcasing their iconic cars and drivers, and I guess the history and pedigree and success they've had in Formula One over many decades, they also showcased the motorsport categories that they race in around the world. And they did that through this tagline called Never Stop Racing. And they did that very well. So I think in future years, we'll see other teams take the same approach. It would be remiss of me before I move on to not talk about the booing incident that took place. For those who are not familiar, we had a predominantly British crowd, and they were booing Max Verstappen, 4-time world champion. Max plays the role of the panto villain very, very well. And every storyline, every piece of theatre needs a villain, right? So there was a statement released from F1 around their position on booing. I'm not sure how I feel about this. I looked at the dictionary definition of booing because I'm a bit of a nerd, and the definition states to show disapproval of a speaker or performer. And I thought long and hard about this, right? This is the beauty of sport, isn't it? That you can have a passion and a love of a sport, and you can express that. You can express that emotion. I understand there's a line and you don't want to cross it. We don't want that emotion to boil over. But in this case, we're talking about at its very heart, sport is built around tribalism and fandom and this idea that you can express yourself. So I've got concerns about the direction we're going here. We're challenging tribalism. I don't want to get into politics and this whole piece around freedom of speech. But at the end of the day, you have to have a sport that promotes tribalism and promotes fandom at its core. And instead, they've put protectionism first. They're protecting a 4-time world champion, and I'm concerned about that direction. Certainly, if the event's at the O2 Arena in 2026, Max Verstappen will not be there. He's made that very clear. All right, moving on to the FIA. There's been this dark cloud kind of hanging over the governing body of motorsport. For the last 12 to 18 months, it's been widely reported, particularly around the leadership of the organisation. And there's this growing divide between F1 and the FIA. And that's kind of come to a head with this announcement or passing down of a regulation around drivers swearing. Now, I thought this extended purely to press conferences and media appearances, and I understood that. They've got a brand to protect. There's a young fan base out there, and the drivers should be professional in their conduct. But I've since found out that it extends to the cockpit. It extends to their conduct in the cockpit. Now, these guys are gladiators. They're performing under duress in a high-intensity environment. And in the heat of the moment, sometimes they swear. I'm not condoning swearing, but in this instance, it's like a Formula One swear jar. It's ridiculous. And I'm going to say this once, but I think it's fucked. That was for the FIA. I don't understand it. I think there's a power play taking place here. And we'll see how it plays out in 2025. But clearly, drivers at some point this year are going to swear, and let's see how or what the response is around the sanctions and fines they put in place. Just on that subject, Formula One has full control over the global broadcast feed, and I cannot understand why they've passed down this regulation when they control the broadcast feed. They can either censor that swearing, or they can choose other content to share with a global audience. So I'm at a loss to understand that one. The other piece of news that's taken place around the FIA in the last few days is the suggestion that Susie Wolff will run for the president's role later this year. A couple of things here. One is that, as I mentioned before, there's 750 million Formula One fans around the world. 41% of that fan base are females. And furthermore, the fastest growing demographic in that fan base is females aged 16 to 24. Now, there's a lot of sporting codes around the world right now that would love to have that level of engagement and connection with that particular demographic. And I think that the benefits of having a female leader in that role as FIA president are profound. So she could significantly shape the future direction of motorsport, and particularly Formula One. Susie's done an amazing job with heading up the Formula One Academy, which is the search for our first female Formula One driver. So just watch this space. My only issue, and no one's talking about this in mainstream media or on any of the podcasts, is around the potential conflict of interest with her husband, Toto, who's CEO and team principal of Mercedes Formula One team. That needs to be addressed. It could be part of a plan as a couple where he will rescind his involvement in the executive leadership of that team. Maybe he maintains his investment in the team and he steps aside, or he exits stage right. That could be part of their succession plan, but clearly that needs to be addressed at some point this year. All right, moving forward to testing really quickly. I'm not a big fan of testing. I watched a few hours. I'd rather watch the cars racing. There wasn't much to take out of testing at the end of the day. The teams are obviously disguising their true performance. And next Saturday in Melbourne, we'll find out the true pecking order. So I will just touch on a couple of things. Carlos Sainz, most laps completed by a driver, 126. He also had the quickest lap time of 129.348. As a Formula One fan, to see Williams fighting back. We all love the legacy of the Williams team and the Williams brand, and it's wonderful to see that they may potentially be the fifth fastest car this year, which is wonderful. Moving forward, Netflix Drive to Survive. I've spent the last 24 hours binge watching this show so I can talk about these episodes. I'm just going to touch on some key insights from my perspective. Episode 1's called Business as Usual. It talks about Lewis signing with Ferrari, but it also follows the storyline around Christian Horner and the allegations made by a female staff member at Red Bull. I'd forgotten how much pressure he was under, and clearly he's weathered that storm, but it must have taken a toll both personally and professionally. He made a comment where he talked about the higher you climb, the sharper the knife. And I thought that was really telling. Episode 2 is called Frenemies, and it follows the story of the friendship of Max and Lando. And what struck me in this episode was just the difference in their mindset and their attitude, and I guess their psychology and the way they go about their racing. So I thought that was really interesting. Episode 5 was called The Curse of Leclerc. It gives you some really great insights into his life in Monaco and the pressure he was under to win his home Grand Prix. It also touches on the impact of his father's death. And just before his father's death, he told him that he'd signed with a Formula One team, which was their shared dream. And he hadn't at that point. And he talked about the guilt that he felt around sharing that with his father, days before he passed away. And then obviously years later fulfilling that destiny. So really inspiring and uplifting story, and clearly a really talented kid. Episode 6 is called Wheels of Fortune. It follows Zach Brown and the Papaya Rules, the fact that McLaren has this policy around having 2 number 1 drivers, which was an issue for them last year and could be an issue for them this year. I feel like Netflix is starting to position Zach as kind of the replacement for Gunter. This idea that he's kind of the jovial character, the larger-than-life character. And they're clearly building this rivalry between him and Christian as well, which is fascinating to watch. Episode 7 was my favorite episode. It's called In the Heat of the Night. Netflix gave 5 cameras to 5 drivers who were friends growing up in karting: Lando, George, Pierre, Alex, and Charles. And they just followed them behind the scenes as they built up to a race weekend in Singapore. Some really fun content, and certainly made me want to go out and buy an airfare to the Singapore Grand Prix this year. It's a wonderful event, and you'll really enjoy that episode. Episode 8 was pretty gritty. It's called Elbows Out. So it follows the story of Checo Perez underperforming in the second Red Bull seat and the fight for that seat amongst Liam, Yuki, and Daniel. One of the key takeouts for me was around the August testing session that Liam Lawson had. On the same day, they asked Max to come into Silverstone in the same car, in the same conditions, and lay down a marker for Liam. He did that. Then Liam hopped into the same car, a car he hadn't driven for 7 or 8 months. and he was within 2/10 of Max. So the team were obviously impressed with that performance, and maybe that went some way to the decision that was made a few months later. Episode 10 is called Endgame. It just leaves fans primed for 2025. It also shares one of the greatest wins in Formula One history, Max Verstappen in Brazil on a wet track, coming through the pack from the back of the field to win that race and seal his 4th title, and just demonstrates, one, his mental strength, but two, just how difficult he's going to be to beat in 2025, even if he is performing in the 2nd, 3rd, or even 4th fastest car. So that's Netflix Drive to Survive. Really interested in your thoughts on the show. Understand there's a little bit of drama and entertainment, a little bit of editing, creative editing that takes place, but it's still a wonderful product, and really keen to hear your thoughts on the show. All right, moving forward, here are my 5 key headlines for 2025. Lewis looks good in red. To have the most successful Formula One driver paired up with the most successful Formula One team is a match made in heaven. I think every Formula One fan is excited about this. We all love that iconic image of Lewis standing in front of Maranello a couple of months ago. The thing that I wanted to speak to was the fact he's brought Angela back as his performance coach. I think that's really significant. So he has talked openly about being energized and in this new environment. He's clearly getting on top of the braking performance of the car, which is where his confidence comes from as a driver. And we saw that in testing a couple of weeks ago. But having Angela back, helping him in be embedded within that new team culture and building that team around him is significant. They've had a lot of success together. He clearly trusts in that relationship. So I think that's a significant acquisition in the off-season as well, and that will probably pay off. My second headline is Max 5 and out. I believe in the next 12 to 18 months, we'll see him announce his exit from Red Bull. Where there's smoke, there's fire in Formula One. There is no doubt that this rumoured offer that Aston Martin have tabled to the tune of around $1 billion over the next 10 years will probably lure him away from Red Bull. I don't think we'll see him make an early announcement this year unless he's out of the championship fight. If he's in the championship fight, then full focus from the team and himself will be on winning that 5th title. But I think longer term, we'll see an announcement about his future. The third headline is Lando has put a target on his back. So 5 minutes after the last race of last season, Lando hopped on the radio to his team engineer and said, I'm going to go one better next year. So he's instantly put a target on his back. The question is, can he cope with that pressure in 2025? My fourth headline is George and Charles have question marks. The reason I've grouped them together is they're both in their 7th season of Formula One. They've both won junior categories. They're both incredibly fast and they're both deeply embedded in their respective teams. But they both have a question mark, right? So there's moments where they make mistakes under pressure. And the question is, can they mount a serious challenge? That's the question that surrounds those two drivers. And my 5th headline, probably the most controversial, is Oscar will break the Papaya Rules. So more to follow on that in a moment. All right, before we move on, I want to talk about, I've called it Rookie Watch. I want to talk about the 6 rookies, the 6 new drivers that have joined the grid this year really quickly. Baby Kimi Antonelli has joined as an 18-year-old, the Mercedes Formula One team. He's clearly quick, but he's clearly going to make mistakes. And the question I've got is around what is the tolerance that Toto and the team will give him throughout the year, bearing in mind that they have Valtteri Bottas sitting there in the reserve driver's seat that they can plug into that team at short notice. So let's just see how he evolves in terms of his development. Liam Lawson. Liam is chasing 0.3 of a second. That's the KPI for Liam Lawson in 2025. Marco has been very clear that Liam needs to finish within 0.3 of a second of Max to I guess, generate some points for the Constructors' title, but more importantly, to act as a rear gunner to Max and support him. So that's his KPI, plain and simple. Let's see how that plays out. I've got a couple of mates in New Zealand who are involved in the motorsport industry. They tell me this kid's fast. This kid can drive anything as well. I think that's going to help him, right? When he gets in the car, that Red Bull car, it's a little bit twitchy, it's a little bit pointy, and there's plenty of second drivers at Red Bull that will vouch for that. And maybe he can get on top of that car. And I certainly think he's going to surprise a lot of people in 2025. I'd expect to see some standout performances from him in the back end of the year. Just remember, he's only had 10 races. I think he'll build into it, but I think in the back half of the year, we'll see some standout performances from him. Gabby has a free pass. Gabriela Bortoleto from Brazil, the reigning F2 champion, takes a step up. And he's clearly got one eye on 2026 in the Audi project. If he does any better than finishing P20, it would be a win. So not much to see there. The next headline is Jack in the Box, Colapinto to replace Doohan. This one's really sad if it plays out, if the rumours are true. In the off-season, Alpine has gone out and signed Franco Colapinto, who comes with significant social media followers. He also comes with a significant financial support. The concern here is that Alpine are not going to go out and spend $20 million, which is the estimated buyout clause in Franco Colapinto's contract if they aren't planning to put him in a race seat. So they've clearly made that investment with a long-term plan. And Jack Doohan is under pressure. He needs to come out of the blocks next week in Melbourne and perform. He's clearly going to be benchmarked against his teammate, Pierre Gasly. Rumours that they may replace him after one race in Australia. There's rumours there's a clause in his contract that they can trigger an exit after 5 races. Jack's under a lot of pressure. Isaac is Le Petit Prost. So that's his nickname. Isaac Hadjar's nickname is the Little Prost. He's French. He won 4 races last year in F2 and finished runner-up. A little bit of a dark horse. So let's just see how he evolves and how he develops over the course of the season. And the last one is probably the most controversial. Ollie to end Ocon. Ollie Beerman is the real deal, in my opinion. Ferrari clearly have a watching brief on him. And I genuinely believe he will end the career of Esteban Ocon at Haas. We're going to see teams at some point shifting their focus to 2026 with such a significant regulation change coming. It'll be interesting to see which teams decide to push deep, chasing championship success, and at what point they shift their focus, if they haven't already, to 2026. So if we see teams and drivers dropping off throughout the course of the year, I think that will signal that perhaps some teams have shifted their focus. All right, here's my prediction. Oscar Piastri will be the 2025 Formula One world champion. Here's my reason why. Everyone's talking about Lando and Max. At the moment, Lando is the favorite in many people's eyes, given that he's in the quickest car. And the reason that there's this perceived favorites tag is because of his qualifying pace against Oscar. So head-to-head last year, he outperformed Oscar 20-4. I've looked into this data in a little bit more detail, and I've taken the next 8 races, the closest 8 races where Lando had the edge over Oscar, and looked at the gap between the two of them in performance. In Hungary, the gap was 0.022. In Vegas, the gap was 0.025. In Spa, the gap was 0.046. In Qatar, the gap was 0.057. In Bahrain, the gap was 0.069. In Miami, the gap was 0.081. In Canada, the gap was 0.082. And in Shanghai, the gap was 0.108. So if you take the average of those 8 races, the gap is 0.061. That's half a tenth. All right. Now, the reason I've chosen 8 races is because if Oscar takes a step in his development in 2025 and he's able to bridge that gap, then those 8 races suddenly swing. There's a tipping point, right? If he's a 10th quicker, there's a tipping point where those qualifying performances mean that he's starting ahead of Lando in a fast car, potentially at this front of the grid. Now, the reason that's important is at that point, it's 12-12 in the head-to-head battle. They're on par. They're in the fastest car, and they're in a championship fight. I believe he has the temperament and the racecraft to outdrive Lando on race day. Now, the reason that's important is Lando's stats speak for themselves. So last year, he started on pole position, I think, 9 times. And on 6 of those occasions, at the end of the first lap, he wasn't leading the race. He lost 30 places across the course of the season, across 24 races. He's going backwards through the pack, and you cannot win a world title when you do that. So he clearly needs to take a step and improve in that space, and he may do that. And if he does, he might be the world champion. Lando's in his 7th season of Formula One. He's had 128 race starts. Oscar's in his 3rd season of Formula One. He's had 46 race starts. You have to believe that there's a steeper development curve for Oscar, and that he could potentially take a bigger step. Now, if he takes a step in qualifying of 0.2 and Lando takes a step of 0.1, then that 0.06 is significant, right? Because it means that Oscar is starting in front of Lando, and we all know how he can race. So I think we need to watch that really, really closely. Everyone's talking about Max and Lando, but I genuinely think Oscar is a real threat, particularly if McLaren have the fastest car, and at this moment in time, we believe they do. There's my prediction for 2025. I'm about to fly out middle of the week to Melbourne. I cannot wait to get to the track. If you're listening to this from somewhere in the world, I'm really sorry you're going to have to get up in the middle of the night with the time zone difference and to watch this race. I do that plenty of times living in Australia, where I stay up late at night on a Sunday night or wake up early on a Monday mornings. Enjoy the race. I look forward to speaking to you next week. And again, thanks for listening.